They say the worst places of the Second World War were the camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that became synonyms for death itself. But there was a place that birthed the executioners, a location few today can point to on a map, though its shadow stretches across every killing field of the Holocaust. A quiet settlement in eastern Poland, one train stop, one fenced compound, one gate: Trawniki. It didn't look like hell. Hell rarely does at first glance. It begins as something ordinary: a row of barracks, a drill field, mud underfoot. And then it swallows men whole. If you stood by the road in the autumn of 1941, when the camp was still new, you might have seen the first column of prisoners arriving. They didn't march. They staggered. Soviet POWs, skin hanging from bones, uniforms in tatters, faces burned by cold and starvation so deep it carved permanent grooves across their cheeks. A few still held the remnant of that stubborn, sullen pride captured soldiers sometimes carry. But most had the look that comes right before collapse, the hollow stare of a man whose life is already traveling ahead of his body. They were not coming to a prison. They had already lived that. They had survived the wire cages of Majdanek and the open-air hell of the Wehrmacht's makeshift death pens. This place was different. A German officer met them at the gate with a thin smile and a sharper voice. "Welcome. Here, you have one choice: serve or die." The gate wasn't threatening. It didn't need to be. Beyond it, the decision was immediate. Those too weak to stand were removed. Removed was the word the Germans liked, the neutral verb that hid the bullets behind a barn. The rest were led past the wooden guard tower, where a sentry leaned on a railing, smoking. No one remembered his face. They remembered the sound of the gate closing behind them, the latch sliding, the small metallic note that told 1,000 future crimes they finally had a home. Trawniki was not a death camp. That's the line historians repeat. But the men who walked through its gate would become the ones who made the death camps work. They arrived as prisoners. They would leave as perpetrators. Not all of them, of course. Some broke, some ran, some resisted. But many accepted the offer that dangled like a piece of meat before starving wolves: survival in exchange for obedience. Not skill, not ideology, obedience. There was no indoctrination speech on the first day, no grand Nazi lecture. The Germans understood something simpler. A starving man will trade anything for life, even his conscience. They took their names first. The Soviets had numbers already, but Trawniki gave them new ones: cleaner, colder, tagged to a ledger like livestock. They stripped in a wooden hut, tossing lice-infested rags into a pile that moved on its own. The SS sprayed them with delousing chemicals that burned the skin and then handed out mismatched garments: German work jackets, captured; Red Army trousers, boots taken off corpses. Nothing fit. Nothing belonged to them. That was the point. Outside, the compound stretched in symmetrical monotony. Long barracks, a parade field carved from mud, a shooting range carved from fear, and the quiet. That unnatural quiet of men who've been broken too recently to speak. But the officer spoke. The first voice most recruits remembered belonged to Karl Streibel, the commandant. Not loud, not theatrical, more like a man reading a funeral announcement. "You have been selected," he said. "You will serve the Reich. If you follow orders, you live. If you fail—" He gestured to the far end of the field, where a stack of fresh earth marked the newest grave. No more explanation needed. And yet something else hung in the air. An offer, a hint of privilege, a key to climb out of the pit of starvation and death. German cigarettes, a thin coat, a bowl of soup thicker than water. You could taste the temptation. Men who hadn't had a warm drink in weeks smelled a whiff of comfort and followed it like dogs. That was the real beginning of Trawniki. Not the gate, not the oath, the soup. Hunger turns morality into an irritant, something to scratch off like scabs. Hunger convinces a man that survival is virtue, and the Germans fed their new recruits well. The first night, after roll call, they received barley soup, dense enough that the spoon resisted. A miracle for men who had eaten sawdust cakes and grass. Some wept into their bowls. Others devoured the food so fast they vomited, then ate again. The SS watched with expressionless satisfaction. Killing a conscience doesn't require torture. It requires nourishment, but at the right moment, after the right deprivation. They slept on wooden bunks, tightly packed, breath hanging in the air like mist. Outside, guards patrolled with dogs whose snarls crawled under the doors. The camp smelled of wet earth, gun oil, and a faint chemical scent that lingered from delousing powder. At dawn, training began, not at the rifle range, not with drills, with silence. The men were marched past the shooting pit where 3 figures knelt. Soviet prisoners, weak, skeletal. No one said why they were there. No one asked. An SS man walked up behind the first one, lifted his pistol, and fired. The shot snapped across the field like a whip. The kneeling body toppled into the pit. Then the second. Then the third. It was a demonstration, but not of punishment. It was a demonstration of normalcy. "This is what failure looks like," the officer said. "This is also what disobedience looks like, and what desertion looks like, and what hesitation looks like. You will learn to obey faster than they did." The recruits stood frozen, breath steaming. Some looked away. Others stared because staring felt safer than blinking. No one cried. In Trawniki, crying meant softness. Softness meant death. They marched on. The drills that followed were brutal in their banality. Hours of running. Hours of crawling in mud cold enough to bite skin. Handling weapons with numb fingers. Cleaning rifles until they shone. The SS didn't care about accuracy yet. They cared about routine, repetition, conditioning. They needed these men to follow orders before they understood the consequences of those orders. If you've ever wondered how mass killers are shaped, it rarely begins with ideology. It begins with habit. Eat at command, sleep at command, stand at command, shoot at command. By the end of the first week, the recruits moved like a single organism. Eyes forward, back straight, minds empty enough that orders fit perfectly. But the Germans weren't done. Late one afternoon, as the sun died behind low clouds, a truck arrived. The canvas flap opened, and 6 Jewish prisoners were pushed out. Men in shirts shredded to ribbons, women whose eyes had the dull sheen of broken glass. The recruits were ordered to surround them. Then came the command that would define Trawniki forever. Fire. Not all weapons fired. Some recruits froze. Some fired into the ground. Some closed their eyes. But enough shots rang out to drop the prisoners in a heap. A few were still alive, groaning. An SS officer walked through the circle and corrected mistakes with his pistol, 1 shot at a time. The recruits were not punished for hesitating, not yet. The Germans understood the psychology of breaking in new killers. You don't demand full obedience on the first kill. You observe, you note who faltered, and you return to them later. That night, the barracks whispered with arguments men didn't dare speak aloud. Some said they had no choice. Some said they should have chosen death. Some said nothing at all, already sinking into the numbness that made obedience easier. The camp didn't sleep. Dogs barked. A generator hummed. A man on the top bunk silently shook until morning. The next day, they did it again. And on the third day, even those who hesitated fired. This was the secret of Trawniki. Not the rifles, not the drills, not the SS slogans. It was the slow erosion of resistance. Kill once, you vomit. Kill twice, you shiver. Kill 3 times. And something inside you stops resisting. You've crossed a point where going back is impossible. Guilt becomes a shadow that follows, but never speaks. By week 3, the recruits were unrecognizable from the starving POWs who had walked through the gate. They stood straighter, their cheeks filled out. They spoke with sharp barks instead of soft murmurs. They had cigarettes, better boots, stronger meals. Power, even the smallest flicker of it, changes the posture of a man. And then came the uniforms. They were not full SS uniforms. Not yet. But they looked close enough. Dark jackets, field gray trousers, polished belts. The men touched the fabric with awe. Clothing has power. A uniform says, you are somebody. You belong. You command. For men who had been treated as expendable animals, the symbolism hit deeper than any ideology. That afternoon, the commandant inspected them. Streibel walked the line slowly, observing them the way a farmer judges livestock, evaluating strength, obedience, usefulness. When he spoke, his words cut like a blade dipped in honey. You are no longer prisoners. You are auxiliaries of the SS. You will be rewarded for loyalty. You will be punished for doubt. The Reich needs men like you. Men like you. For some, it was the closest thing to dignity they'd heard in years. The transformation was nearly complete. Not ideological Nazis, not convinced believers, just men who had been starved, threatened, fed, shaped, and now felt the seductive promise of survival paired with authority. At night, one recruit, no one remembers his name, told a bunkmate that he felt like he was becoming two people, one who remembered who he had been before the war, and one who was taking his place. I think, he whispered, the new one will win. He was right. By the time winter arrived, Trawnike's gate had consumed hundreds of men, reshaping them into something the Nazis needed. Not thinkers, not leaders, but obedient executioners who would soon be scattered across the killing centers of occupied Poland. They didn't yet know where they were going. They didn't know the names of the places waiting for them: Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor. They only knew the next order would come soon. And when it did, most of them would follow without question. That was the genius and the horror of Trawniki. It didn't kill men. It turned them into the instruments that would. Snow came early that year. Not the peaceful kind. Not the soft flakes drifting like feathers. This was the hard, wind-driven winter of eastern Poland. Snow that cut across skin like powdered glass. A cold that crawled into bones and stayed there. By December 1941, the men of Trawniki had already changed. But winter finished what hunger and violence had started. It froze whatever compassion was left and sharpened obedience into instinct. At dawn, the camp looked almost serene. Frost coated the fences in delicate crystals. Smoke rose from chimneys in perfect vertical lines. A thin layer of snow softened the outlines of the barracks. From a distance, nothing suggested that inside those walls, men were being reshaped into something dangerous. Snow always lies. It covers what it shouldn't. It hides sins beneath silence. Revel came before sunrise. A whistle. Boots on wooden floors. The familiar sting of cold air hitting skin as the barracks door swung open. Winter didn't slow the schedule. It only made the punishments more creative. Those who stumbled on the ice were forced to crawl through snow until their hands turned numb and purple. The Germans understood something primitive. Suffering cleans the mind. It strips away doubt. It leaves only instinct. The men no longer flinched at cruelty. They hardly noticed it. When one recruit collapsed during morning drill, the SS kicked him aside and ordered the rest to continue. They stepped around the body as if it were just part of the ground. Later, they saw the same recruit dragged toward the back fence and heard a single crack of a pistol. No one asked his name. No one wondered why he was shot. In Trawniki, the why never mattered, only the act. But the Germans had new plans for their trainees. The first phase, obedience, was complete. The second phase would be worse. One morning, The recruits were marched to a large shed near the edge of the camp. They had seen the building before but never entered it. The walls were stained, the door reinforced. An SS sergeant unlocked it, and the smell hit them first. A sour, metallic scent, mixed with wet straw, and something more disturbing. The faint, familiar odor of fear. Inside the shed, several Jewish prisoners stood chained to posts. They were alive, barely. Their faces were swollen, their clothing ripped, their breath fogging in weak, trembling bursts. The recruits were ordered to form a circle around them. The sergeant spoke slowly, with the calm enthusiasm of someone discussing farm equipment. "You have learned discipline," he said. "Now you will learn initiative." Initiative, a word that, in another time, meant creativity, leadership, responsibility. In Trawniki, it meant something very different, developing a willingness to kill without being told. The sergeant tossed a shovel at the feet of the nearest recruit. The metal rang against the frozen floor like a bell that announced something irreversible. The recruit didn't move. "Pick it up," the sergeant said. Silence stretched. The recruit's hands shook as he lifted the shovel. His eyes flicked to the prisoner chained closest to him, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17. The sergeant smiled. "Show me you belong here." The recruit took a step forward, then another. His breath quickened. His eyes darted toward the other trainees, as if searching for permission, or escape, or anything that might anchor him to the world he used to know. But that world had ended the moment he walked through the gate. He swung. Not well. Not cleanly. The shovel struck the prisoner's shoulder first, then scraped across bone. The prisoner screamed. The sergeant didn't flinch. The recruit, desperate to finish what he'd started, swung again, this time hitting the head. The scream cut off. Blood spread across the straw like dark ink. "Good," the sergeant said. Next, he tossed the shovel toward another man. This one didn't hesitate. That was the moment the last barrier broke. Once you make a man commit a crime he can never undo, you own him. Shame becomes a chain stronger than fear. Guilt becomes a leash. A killer can rationalize his own survival, but he can never walk away from what he's done. And the Germans knew it. When the training ended, the shed floor was splattered with blood, and the recruits stepped back into the daylight with blank expressions. Their faces were pale, but not with remorse, only exhaustion. Killing was hard work the first few times. Later, it would become easier. Later, it would become routine. The recruits didn't speak that night. The barracks was silent, except for the creaking wood and the occasional cough. No one mentioned the shed, but every man lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to his heartbeat pounding in the dark, wondering if he had crossed a line he could never return from. The answer was yes. The next stage of training began with a lecture the following morning. Not propaganda, not ideology. The SS rarely wasted time on abstract concepts. Instead, they taught logistics, how to process prisoners, how to escort transports, how to shoot efficiently in groups, how to conserve ammunition. Killing wasn't presented as an act of hatred. It was presented as a job, a task, a responsibility. The Germans didn't ask the recruits to believe in the final solution. They asked them to participate, and participation, they understood, was stronger than belief. New weapons arrived. Submachine guns with oiled bolts that clicked smoothly when handled. The recruits practiced assembling and disassembling them with speed. They learned to fire in short bursts, not long sprays. They learned to move as units, to sweep through buildings, to herd groups of prisoners without panic or hesitation. They learned to close in, not step back. Sometimes the SS used scarecrow targets. Sometimes they used dogs. But more often, they used human beings, Jews taken from nearby ghettos, political prisoners transported from Lublin, anyone the Nazis deemed expendable. Shooting at a target that screamed and bled changed something inside a trainee. The recoil became familiar. The sound of bone breaking under a bullet became a dull, expected note. There was no moral lesson, only technique. One Wednesday, the recruits were taken beyond the fence for the first time. Snow blanketed the fields, turning the landscape into a stark, monotone canvas. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that promised more storm. They marched until they reached a small village, just a cluster of cottages with smoke rising from chimneys. The recruits formed a perimeter while the SS entered the houses. They dragged out the villagers, women, children, elderly men, lining them up in the center of the square. A few men protested. The butt of a rifle silenced them. A lieutenant turned to the trainees. "This village has been helping partisans," he said. "Your task is simple." He gestured. The recruits raised their weapons. Some aimed high, intending to miss. They quickly learned what happened to those who hesitated. An SS officer walked behind them, watching the angles of their rifles. A man who aimed above the crowd received a blow to the back of the head from the officer's pistol. The second blow knocked out teeth. The third blow left the recruit half-conscious, in the snow. The rest fired. It was quick, efficient, mechanical. When it was over, the lieutenant nodded with satisfaction. The trainees were ordered to search the houses, take anything of value, and burn the village to the ground. Flames rose through the snow, smoke curling upward in dark spirals. The recruits left the village behind without looking back. On the march home, one man vomited into the snow. He didn't fall out of formation. Another man whispered a prayer, quietly, carefully, without moving his lips. The camp welcomed them with dinner, warm, filling, spiced. The contrast between the burning village and the steaming soup was almost surreal. But that was the design. Violence followed by comfort. Fear followed by reward. A perfect Pavlovian loop. Winter deepened. Temperatures dropped. Discipline hardened. The men became faster, stronger, more brutal. Their bodies adapted to the cold. Their minds adapted to something far worse. One night, a new batch of Soviet POWs arrived. Skeletal, filthy, half-frozen. The recruits watched from behind the barracks as the newcomers were herded through the gate. A few whispered, "That used to be me." But no one stepped forward. No one helped them. Compassion is dangerous in a place like Trawniki. It creates cracks. And cracks lead to collapse. The SS began selecting the best trainees for special duties. Men with steady hands were trained to use pistols for close-range corrections. Men with strong voices were taught to command work details. Men who showed initiative, real initiative, the kind that required no prompting, were marked for transfer to the Aktion Reinhard camps. The recruits didn't know the names of those places yet. They only knew rumors, whispers of camps farther east where Jews vanished in tens of thousands. They assumed those were labor camps. They assumed wrong. But assumptions were irrelevant. Obedience required no understanding. Then came the night of the storm. Wind howled through the camp like a living thing, rattling shutters, overturning buckets, slamming doors. Snow arrived sideways, thick and fast. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The camp's generator sputtered, and the lights flickered in eerie pulses. Sometime after midnight, an alarm sounded. Recruits stumbled from their bunks, grabbing rifles, running through snow that swallowed their boots. The SS shouted over the wind. Prisoners had escaped. 3 Jewish laborers working in the kitchen had slipped away during the storm. Search parties fanned out. Dogs barked, straining at leashes. The storm swallowed sound and distorted shapes. The men moved through forest where branches snapped under the weight of ice. The dogs caught the scent near a ravine. The escapees hadn't made it far. The cold had slowed them. Hunger had weakened them. Their footprints trailed into a thicket. The recruits found them huddled beneath a fallen tree, barely conscious, barely alive. The SS officer in charge looked at the trainees. "Your turn," he said. The recruits raised their rifles, but the officer shook his head. Not like that. He pointed to the ravine. Down there. The meaning was clear. They were to push the prisoners over the edge and watch them fall. One recruit hesitated. Just a flicker of reluctance. A pause too long. The officer noticed. Without warning, he struck the recruit across the face with the butt of his pistol. The blow split skin and knocked the man into the snow. "Do you think you're here to think?" the officer shouted above the wind. "Do you think you are still human?" The recruit staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his cheek. He obeyed. The prisoners fell silently, swallowed by the dark ravine. The storm covered everything, the footprints, the blood, the evidence. By morning, the snow had erased the night's cruelty, leaving behind a calm landscape that lied again, as snow always does. The next day, the SS singled out the same recruit who hesitated. They didn't punish him. They rewarded him. A warm coat, a cigarette, a nod of approval. Confusion flickered across his face. Then it settled into acceptance. The lesson was clear. Obedience brings pain, then reward. Disobedience brings only death. As winter dragged on, the men of Trawniki rarely spoke of what they'd done. Silence became another weapon, another part of training. The camp didn't need confessions. It needed killers who didn't question themselves. By February, the transformation was undeniable. They no longer walked like prisoners. They walked like guards. Their eyes stayed still, their expressions flat. They had learned to compartmentalize, to place every atrocity into a mental box and seal it shut. One night, as frost collected on the window and wind moaned through the barracks walls, a recruit whispered to the man in the next bunk, "I don't know who I am anymore." His bunkmate didn't answer. He didn't need to. No one in Trawniki knew who they were anymore. But soon, the Germans would decide that for them. The day was coming when the recruits would be given orders not inside the training ground, but far beyond it. Orders that would take them to the heart of the final solution. Orders that would test whether Trawniki had truly succeeded in its purpose. The gate had consumed them. Now it was time to release what it created. Spring did not come to Trawniki the way it came to the rest of Poland. Beyond the fences, fields softened. Snow melted into muddy rivulets. Birds reappeared in the trees. But inside the camp, winter lingered in the men's faces. Something cold had taken root in them, something that no sunlight could thaw. Even as the days lengthened and the air warmed, the recruits moved with the heavy stillness of men who had forgotten how to expect gentleness. The transformation was nearly complete. It showed in the way they cleaned their rifles with reverence, the way they carried themselves on the drill field, the way they no longer flinched when an SS officer passed. It showed in their silence. Not a fearful silence anymore, a practiced one. A silence that belonged to men who had learned to swallow their thoughts whole. By March 1942, rumors spread through the barracks. Something was coming. Something bigger than drills, bigger than village operations, bigger than anything they had done so far. The SS officers walked with a new sense of urgency. Meetings behind closed doors increased. Maps appeared. Telegrams arrived by motorcycle. A new tone settled over the camp, a hum of anticipation mixed with danger. The recruits didn't know the name yet, but something called Aktion Reinhard was beginning. One evening after roll call, the commandant himself appeared on the parade ground. Streibel rarely addressed the men directly, unless the message was significant. He stood beside a truck with its engine idling, exhaust curling like smoke from a ritual pyre. He looked at the recruits the way a sculptor might look at statues he had nearly finished carving. "You have been tested," he said. "You have shown loyalty and strength. Now you will serve the Reich where you are needed most." He paused, letting the words settle like dust on stone. "Some of you will be transferred to new facilities. You will assist in implementing crucial security measures. The success of these operations depends on your discipline." He didn't say what those facilities were. He didn't need to. The mystery made the assignment sound important, glorious even. Recruits straightened their backs, eyes tightening with a mixture of fear and pride. Then he began calling numbers. One by one, men stepped forward, each experiencing the same conflicting rush: relief at being chosen, terror at what the assignment meant, shame at hoping their number would not be next. Selections were arbitrary. At least that's how it felt. In reality, the SS had been observing them for months, noting who hesitated, who thrived, who followed orders without emotion. When the first group of 60 men stood ready, Streibel dismissed the rest. The chosen were ordered to gather their belongings and report by dawn. The others returned to the barracks, pretending they didn't envy the ones leaving. But the truth was, every man left behind wondered if not being chosen meant he wasn't strong enough or brutal enough. Dawn broke pale and thin. A mist clung to the ground as if reluctant to lift. The selected recruits lined up by the truck, rifles slung across their backs, their breath forming brief clouds that vanished as quickly as their doubts. They boarded the trucks without knowing their destination. What they didn't realize was that this was the moment they truly left their former selves behind. The road out of Trawniki might as well have been a road out of humanity. The trucks rumbled along dirt roads bordered by bare branch trees. The countryside awakened slowly, farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys, children walking to wells, villagers pushing carts through muddy lanes. The recruits stared at them without expression, as if observing another species. Civilians looked back with suspicion or fear, or the blank acceptance that war had carved into everyone. Hours passed before the trucks finally slowed. Ahead stood a railway spur, a new construction, unfinished, temporary, silent. Beyond it, a large clearing. No fences yet, no gates. Just a vast, empty space surrounded by pine forest. Workmen hammered posts into the ground. A mound of freshly turned earth rose like a scar across the clearing. Smoke drifted from something unseen. The recruits stepped out of the trucks, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. A German officer waited for them. Not SS. At least, not in the traditional black uniform. He wore field gray and carried a riding crop. His expression was unsettlingly casual, like a man assessing workers for a construction project. "Welcome," he said. "You'll assist with site preparation." He called it a site. He did not call it by its true name, Belzec. At that moment, Belzec was still becoming, still emerging from blueprints and orders, still pretending, for just a little while longer, that it wasn't being built to disappear human beings. The recruits were told it was a transit camp, a place for Jews to be relocated. They'd heard the term before. Resettlement, evacuation, euphemisms that spread across occupied Poland like mold, soft, pervasive, deadly. Of course, the recruits knew these words were lies, but lies made obedience easier. The officer led them to the far end of the clearing, where a group of Jewish laborers worked under guard. They carried planks, dug trenches, and hammered boards with trembling hands. Their eyes flickered toward the new arrivals, with a mixture of terror and resigned understanding. They had seen men in uniforms before, men with rifles who stood tall and didn't look them in the eye. The recruits stood among them now, no longer starving, no longer powerless. The first assignment wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even violent, at least not at first. They hauled timber, they guarded laborers, they supervised trench digging, they learned the layout of the future camp, the receiving area, the undressing barracks, the path known as the tube, and the building that workmen began calling the bathhouse. The recruits didn't need detailed explanations. The shape of things hinted at their purpose. But something else happened during those early days at Belzec. Something subtle, deceptively small, but critical. They stopped seeing Jewish laborers as people. It didn't happen with a single event. It happened through repetition, through the way the SS spoke, never men, always Jews. Through the way laborers were worked until collapse, then replaced. Through the way some guards kicked a prisoner for slowing down, and how no one reacted. Through the quiet moments when a trainee realized he felt nothing when a prisoner begged for water. The moral distance widened a little each day, like frost cracking stone. One afternoon, a laborer collapsed near the trench, exhausted, starved. His shovel slipped from his fingers, clattering against the dirt. The recruit nearest him ordered him to stand. The man tried, failed, fell again. A dog barked. An SS guard arrived. "Fix it," the SS said. "Not punish, not help, not shoot. Just fix it." The recruit hesitated for a heartbeat, the faintest echo of who he used to be. Then he raised his rifle and fired. The body slumped into the trench. The SS nodded approvingly. The lesson was clear. Efficiency mattered more than compassion. The dead were obstacles. The living were tools. And the recruits were becoming the mechanism that kept the system running smoothly. Days blurred into one another. The camp grew. Fences went up, gates installed, barracks completed. The building at the far end of the clearing, the bathhouse, took shape faster than anything else. Thick walls, sealed doors, a roof with apertures that looked suspiciously reinforced. Some recruits whispered questions, quickly, quietly. But questioning was discouraged with contemptuous smirks from the SS. One officer gestured to the structure with a shrug. "Jews bathe, Jews leave. That is all you need to know." But even lies have seams and cracks form under the weight of truth. The truth arrived in the form of a train. It came on a cold morning, steam billowing like breath from a giant beast. Boxcars rattled to a stop near the spur. At first, the recruits thought the train held supplies. They thought it was for construction materials or food for the camp. Then they heard the banging, the screams, the frantic, muffled pounding from inside the wooden cars. And the truth was no longer something whispered. It was a sound. The SS officers did not act surprised. They did not act alarmed. They had been waiting. "Open it," one commanded. Recruits approached the boxcars, hands trembling, not from fear of what they might see, but fear of not reacting the way the SS expected. They unlatched the doors. A wave of stench spilled out, urine, sweat, excrement, panic. Inside, dozens of Jews collapsed forward, blinded by daylight, gasping for air. Men, women, children. They were packed so tightly that when the door opened, they leaned out as a single mass, as if human bodies had fused under pressure. The SS barked orders. Dogs snarled. Recruits formed a corridor, rifles raised, herding the prisoners toward the receiving area. Some Jews stumbled, some cried, some didn't move at all, already dead, suffocated during the journey. One recruit whispered, "This is not relocation." The SS officer standing beside him replied, "Correct," then smiled. "Now you understand." The Jews were separated, men to one side, women and children to the other. Recruits were ordered to stand guard as the next stage began. One officer shouted announcements in Polish and German, telling the prisoners they would bathe, be disinfected, receive food, clothing, onward transport. The tone was soothing, almost cheerful. The lie was the point. The calm was the weapon. The recruits watched as the first group, the women, were led into the undressing barracks, their clothing piled in heaps. Guards shouted at them to hurry. Children cried, clutching anything they could. Mothers soothed them, not knowing they were leading them into death. The recruits weren't allowed inside the building, but they heard everything, crying, begging, praying. The sounds stuck to their skin like cold air. After some time, the SS brought the recruits closer to the bathhouse. They were told to stand behind a cordon and observe. The doors were sealed. The engine that powered the gas system rumbled to life. The sound was mechanical, steady, emotionless. Some recruits looked away. Some stared straight ahead. None stepped forward. It took minutes. Only minutes. When the engine shut off, silence fell. A silence thicker than snow, heavier than winter. A silence that didn't feel natural. The doors were opened. Workmen, Jewish laborers still alive for now, entered with hooks and carts. And the recruits saw bodies piled together, faces contorted in frozen terror, limbs tangled in desperate knots. Children curled into their mothers. Women collapsed atop one another, nails embedded in wood from clawing for air. The recruits inhaled sharply. Some flinched. Some swallowed hard. Some felt nothing at all because feeling would have been fatal. Then came the order. You will help with removal. Not digging, not guarding, not observing. Removal. The recruits stepped inside, boots slipping on the slick floor, the air thick with a metallic sweetness that made them lightheaded. They grabbed bodies under the arms, dragging them out like sacks of grain. Hands brushed against limp skin, tangled hair, vacant eyes. The weight of the dead pressed into their shoulders, their backs, their conscience. If any part of it survived Trawniki. Outside, the corpses were stacked like timber, numbered, counted, processed. And the recruits realized something terrible. This wasn't a job they were assisting with. This was the job. By the time the sun set, the recruits had worked for hours, lifting bodies, washing floors, carrying buckets of water, helping dig pits. Their arms burned, their lungs stung, their minds were numb. That night, back in the barracks built for guards, they sat on bunks, staring at their hands as though expecting to see blood. Some whispered prayers. Some stared into the dark, unblinking. A few vomited behind the barracks. But no one said they would refuse to continue. Because by now, they understood something even more terrifying than what they had seen. There was no returning to who they had been. Once a man becomes part of a machine like Belzec, the machine keeps him, holds him, shapes him, feeds him, rewards him, and punishes him brutally if he hesitates. The next morning, another train arrived, and the recruits knew exactly what they would do. They no longer needed explanations. They no longer needed lies. They had crossed the threshold. They had become the hands that carried out the final solution. Trawniki had created them. Belzec had claimed them. And soon, other camps, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, would demand their service. Because now, the machine was running, and men were needed to keep it running. By the summer of 1942, the machine was running at full speed. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, three names that would later be spoken in the same breath as Auschwitz, though their function was different, more singular, more brutally efficient. These were not labor camps, not factories, not prisons. They were destinations, places designed for only one purpose: to erase, to unmake human beings, to turn entire populations into absence. The men of Trawniki were the gears that made this machinery operate. By then, the SS no longer saw them as trainees or auxiliaries. They were specialists. They were needed. And that need gave them a disturbing sense of purpose. After several weeks in Belzec, the time came to redistribute the recruits across the other Aktion Reinhard sites. The summons arrived before dawn, carried by a courier whose boots dripped with dew. The chosen men gathered their few belongings, slung rifles over their shoulders, and boarded trucks. The engine growled, exhaust swirling through cold morning air. They didn't ask where they were going. That question had died inside them months ago. The roads grew narrower as the trucks traveled east, winding through forests and meadows that looked deceptively peaceful. Farmers tilled fields. Crows perched on fence posts. A river glimmered through the trees like a strip of polished metal. None of it matched the destination awaiting them. None of it hinted that, just beyond a bend, they would reach one of the darkest places on Earth. Sobibor. The camp appeared suddenly, barbed wire, guard towers, rows of barracks, and a long, narrow path leading deeper inside. The tube. The recruits recognized the design from Belzec, a familiarity that came far too easily. A senior SS officer greeted them with a smile that did not reach his eyes. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, uncomfortably warm. "You've done good work," he said. "Now you'll help here." Help, the word twisted into something grotesque. Sobibor felt different from Belzec, newer, smaller, but more organized. The system here was practiced, almost refined. Trains arrived on schedule, prisoners were processed without confusion. The whole operation felt like a macabre assembly line. In Belzec, the chaos was part of the horror. In Sobibor, the order was. The recruits were divided into groups: perimeter guards, undressing area supervisors, escorts along the tube, workers assigned to maintain the gas chambers, and those chosen for the sorting crew, responsible for searching clothing, cutting hair from the dead, collecting valuables. The latter assignment was both physically easier and spiritually harder. Handling dead bodies was one thing. Handling the belongings they'd carried minutes before death was another. Tiny shoes, a ribbon, a photograph, a wedding ring still warm. Every object whispered a story the camp tried to silence. The men didn't speak of the whispers. They tried not to hear them. In the first days at Sobibor, the recruits learned the camp's rhythm. Trains arrived. The Jews inside were told they were being relocated for work. They were instructed to undress, fold their clothes neatly, tie their shoes together. Order created calm. Calm created compliance. Compliance made killing efficient. Recruits shouted instructions in broken Polish, Yiddish, Ukrainian, Russian. Whatever words kept the crowd moving. They didn't need to understand the language. They only needed to push the human tide forward. Women braided their daughters' hair one last time. Men whispered prayers under their breath. Children clung to their mothers, confused. The recruits kept them moving. The dogs barked, the SS watched, and the gas chambers filled. The sound of mass death was not what the recruits expected. It wasn't loud. It was muffled, a rising hum of panic that peaked quickly, then faded. The building shook slightly, like something large shifting inside. Then silence. That silence became normal, far too quickly. After the killings, the recruits joined the burial crew. The ground in Sobibor refused the dead. The soil was too wet. The pits filled too fast. Bodies had to be burned. Flames licked at the sky day after day. Thick smoke drifting into the forest, settling onto the camp like a gray veil. Every man in Sobibor carried that smell in his hair, his clothes, his skin. It clung to them even when they slept. At night, the recruits ate dinner in the guards' barracks. Soup, bread, meat, cigarettes. They drank, sometimes heavily. Alcohol blurred memories, softened edges, dulled the part of the brain that still recognized horror. Laughter erupted at odd moments, forced, sharp, desperate. A man joked that the fire pits were eternal candles. Another bragged about how quickly he could move prisoners through the tube. The rest laughed because not laughing felt dangerous. Sobibor was not simply a place of killing. It was a place of forgetting. A place where men learned to live with what they did, by pretending it wasn't happening. Then came Treblinka. The first time the recruits arrived at Treblinka II, they felt as though they were stepping into a replica of Belzec, only larger, more chaotic, more frantic. Treblinka was a monster with many mouths. It devoured entire transports in hours. It swallowed thousands a day. The men assigned to Treblinka had seen death before, but nothing like this. Trains arrived packed with Jews from Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, Vienna, Berlin. The density was unimaginable. When the doors opened, bodies fell out in heaps, some alive, many not. The air was thick with heat, sweat, and desperation. The SS officers barked orders so rapidly, even the recruits struggled to keep up. The lines, had to move faster, always faster. The killing chambers needed to be filled again and again. The pits overflowed. Burning was constant. Smoke rose like black columns, blotting the sky. The recruits were expected to function without hesitation. They forced prisoners into lines. They beat those who slowed. They separated families with practiced cruelty. They dragged bodies when the gas chambers opened. They stood guard as the ground quivered, as if shuddering under the weight of what it held. Some recruits shut down emotionally. They worked like machines. Others grew cruel, drunk on the authority the SS granted them. They screamed, hit, mocked, humiliated. Power warped them quickly. In Treblinka, brutality wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Yet a few recruits broke. One day, after hauling bodies for hours, a man suddenly collapsed. Not from exhaustion. His mind simply snapped. He stood in the middle of the yard, trembling, muttering prayers that made no sense. The SS noticed. A shot rang out moments later. His body was tossed onto the fires with the rest. The remaining recruits understood the message. Breaking was not allowed. But something else stirred beneath Treblinka's machinery. Something unexpected, something dangerous, whispers of resistance. Jews in the sorting yards exchanged glances, gestures, fragments of coded messages. A young man working at the pits hid tools. Another memorized guard routines. A prisoner in the tailor shop smuggled scraps of fabric to wrap around stolen bullets. The recruits didn't know the details. Not yet. But they sensed tension in the air. The way the Jewish workers walked with purpose. The way their eyes lingered too long on guard towers. The quick, whispered conversations at dusk. Then, suddenly, a transfer order arrived. Some recruits were sent back to Trawniki. Others moved to Sobibor. A few were reassigned to smaller camps scattered across Poland. The SS rotated them frequently, preventing anyone from forming friendships with Jewish workers, preventing the recruits themselves from growing comfortable. One group of men, some veterans of Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, returned to Trawniki to train the next wave of auxiliaries. They looked older than their age. Their eyes had lost the spark of youth, replaced by a flat, metallic stare. Their posture was rigid, their movements sharp, their faces expressionless. New recruits looked at them with a mix of awe and fear. These returning men carried the stench of burning bodies in their uniforms, even after washing. It never left. It lived in the fabric. It lived in them. Back at Trawniki, the training program intensified. The instructors, former recruits themselves, taught with a cruelty they had learned from the camps. Hazing became harsher, punishments more severe. The transformation from prisoner to killer accelerated. And then came the uprising. First in Treblinka, then in Sobibor. Explosions, gunfire. Jewish prisoners attacking guards, cutting fences, storming gates. Recruits fled. Some fought. Some ran into the woods and were hunted down. A few were killed by prisoners. For a moment, a single, fragile moment, the machinery of death faltered. But the SS regained control quickly. The camps were liquidated. Evidence buried or burned. Survivors hunted across Europe. And the recruits? They became liabilities. Some were transferred to forced labor duties in Italy. Others to guard work in concentration camps across the Reich. A few desertions occurred. A handful vanished into forests, hoping to escape the war entirely. But the SS remembered names. They remembered numbers. And when the war turned against Germany, the most expendable men were sent to the front, thrown into collapsing trenches, used as cannon fodder. Those who survived fled west. Some surrendered to the Allies, hiding their past behind forged papers. A few made it to America, Canada, Australia, blending into immigrant neighborhoods, working in factories, raising families, pretending their hands were clean. Trawniki was closed by 1944, but its men lived on, in courtrooms, in news headlines, in testimonies whispered decades later. and in the memories of those who survived the camps, few enough to count. Because the machinery they served was vast. But without them, it would never have run. They say history buries its darkest secrets. But sometimes the shadows don't stay underground. Sometimes they crawl back into the world decades later, quietly, unexpectedly, wearing new names, new clothing, new lives. The men of Trawniki didn't disappear. They scattered, like ash, like ghosts, like something the world tried to forget but never fully could. By 1944, Germany was losing the war. The front lines collapsed inward, like a dying creature folding into itself. Retreat became routine. Panic grew behind closed doors. The machinery of the final solution was breaking down, not by moral awakening, but by military catastrophe. The SS dismantled Belzec. They destroyed Sobibor. They burned Treblinka to the ground, planted trees over the mass graves, plowed the earth as if trying to erase an entire dimension of reality. But the soil remembered. The silence remembered. And so did the men who had been forged in those camps. Trawniki still operated for a while, training more auxiliaries for collapsing fronts, guarding forced labor factories, executing forced evacuations. But its purpose was fading, replaced by desperation. The SS no longer needed specialists in killing Jews. They needed bodies, cheap, expendable, silent. The recruits, once valued, now became burdens. Some were sent to the front. Others, reassigned to guard columns of prisoners, forced to march west as the Red Army advanced. These marches, later called death marches, were some of the cruelest episodes of the war. Exhausted prisoners stumbled through snow, mud, frost, collapsing one by one. The Trawniki men guarding them didn't need training for this. Killing stragglers was what they had been shaped for. It required no new skill. But their world was shrinking. The Reich was shrinking. Every road west carried the same rumor. The Americans were coming. The British were coming. The Soviets were behind them. The empire that once felt invincible was dissolving like smoke. In the chaos, the Trawniki men saw a chance. They began slipping away. One disobeyed a marching order and vanished into the forest. Another deserted during a transfer. A few hid among civilian refugees, burning their papers, changing their clothing, burying their uniforms under branches and mud. Some surrendered to Allied troops, pretending to be simple laborers or farmers displaced by the war. Most of them succeeded. The Allies were overwhelmed. Millions of people wandered through Europe, displaced, starved, traumatized. Sorting perpetrators from victims was almost impossible. And so the ghosts of Trawniki blended into the crowd like ink, dissolving into water. They crossed borders. Some found work in Germany. Some boarded ships to Canada, Brazil, Australia. Some walked into American immigration offices with forged identity papers and quiet smiles. They didn't boast. They didn't brag. They didn't draw attention. They simply constructed new lives as if building a wall between themselves and their past. One man became a factory worker in Ohio. Another, a mechanic in New Jersey. Yet another bought a house in Chicago, attended church, raised children. Neighbors described them as polite, hardworking, ordinary. Ordinary. Such a dangerous word. For decades, the ghosts walked in daylight. They mowed their lawns. They bought groceries. They watched baseball games, drank beer with coworkers, attended their children's graduations. Their hands, which had dragged bodies from gas chambers, now fixed engines or chopped firewood. Their eyes, which had once watched flames consume entire pits of corpses, now watched television with their families. The world had moved on. But history has a habit of circling back. The Jewish survivors of Sobibor and Treblinka were few. So few, they could fit into a single room. But they remembered faces, voices, gates. They remembered cruelty. They remembered kindness too. Small acts, tiny gestures. But mostly, they remembered the men in uniforms who shouted orders and held rifles. They remembered the Trawniki men. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Those survivors were interviewed one by investigators across the world. Prosecutors dug into archives, matched testimonies, traced immigration records. New technologies emerged. Photographs enhanced, handwriting analyzed, documents cross-referenced. State by state, country by country, the ghosts were found. A knock on a door in Cleveland. A phone call from immigration services in Toronto. A letter summoning a grandfather in Sydney to court. One by one, the ghosts stepped back into the light. And one by one, their new worlds fell apart. In courtrooms, they looked small, older, fragile, hair white, hands trembling. They insisted they had been forced. They insisted they had never killed anyone. They insisted they were innocent laborers. They insisted the survivors were mistaken. But the shadows behind them told a different story. The numbers tattooed into SS rosters, the lists from Trawniki, the rosters from Sobibor, the testimony of witnesses who survived by miracle. The truth had a long memory, much longer than the men expected. The trials were strange, more like exorcisms than legal proceedings. Judges listened. Survivors testified with voices that cracked but did not break. The men of Trawniki sat silent, sometimes staring at the floor, sometimes meeting the eyes of those who had walked through hell and lived to describe it. There was no rage in most survivors, only a cold clarity. They had waited decades for this moment. But something else lingered in the courtroom, an unspoken question that hovered like smoke. What makes a man cross the line? Was it hunger, fear, ambition, obedience? Or was it something darker, something in human nature itself, a capacity that exists in all of us, waiting for the wrong hunger, the wrong fear, the wrong authority? Some Trawniki men were stripped of citizenship, some deported. A few tried to flee again, unsuccessfully. Some died before sentencing. Some were sent to Germany or Poland to face further charges. And some, very few, were convicted and imprisoned. But punishment was not the heart of these cases. The heart was recognition. The world wanted to say to them, "We know what you did. We remember. You cannot outrun the past." One case became famous, the case of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-born immigrant living quietly in America, working as a mechanic for decades. A man whose neighbors described him as kind, polite, soft-spoken. A grandfather who smiled at grocery store cashiers. But his name appeared in Trawniki documents. His photograph appeared on an ID card, stamped with an SS eagle. He had served at Sobibor. His trial stretched across continents, tangled in appeals, denials, conflicting testimony, political pressures. The truth, as always in human stories, was messy. But one fact remained solid. Trawniki had shaped him. For years, people debated whether he had been coerced, whether he had been misidentified, whether someone else had wielded the weapon in his hand. But the deeper truth was simpler. The system he served required ordinary men. Men who wanted to live. Men who followed orders. Men who believed survival absolved them. But survival does not absolve. Not in history. Not in memory. Not in the quiet hours of the night, when the past scratches at the mind like a trapped animal. In the late 20th century, historians began piecing together the story of Trawniki. Records surfaced. Testimonies were compared. The camp, once obscure, emerged as a central node of the Holocaust. Less visible than Auschwitz, less infamous than Treblinka, but just as deadly in its consequences. Because without Trawniki, the death camps would have lacked hands, and without hands, the machinery would not have run. The tragedy of Trawniki was not only what the men did, but how easily they became the people who did it. Some had been farmers, some factory workers, some students, some barely adults. All had been broken by war, hunger, captivity. Then rebuilt, not into soldiers, not into Nazis, but into tools. Tools that killed because they were told to. Tools that didn't think because thinking hurt too much. Tools that survived by surrendering the part of themselves that asked why. Decades later, in courtrooms, survivors asked the same men one question: "Did you ever think of refusing?" Not one gave a clear answer. Some said they would have been shot. Some said they didn't know their actions led to death. Some said they remembered nothing. Silence often followed. But survivors knew the truth. Everyone always has a choice. Some choices kill you. Some choices turn you into something worse. Trawniki thrived because too many men chose survival over conscience. Historians call it a training camp. Survivors call it something else, a factory where ordinary men became instruments of genocide. And yet, the deepest horror isn't that Trawniki existed. It's that it could exist again, anywhere, in any war, with any group of desperate men. Because the lesson of Trawniki is not limited to the 1940s. It whispers to every generation: evil does not need monsters. It only needs hungry men, frightened men, obedient men. The gate at Trawniki is gone now. The barracks collapsed. The fields grew wild. Grass blankets the earth that once shook beneath marching boots. Birds nest in the remains of the watchtower. The wind carries nothing but its own voice. But if you stand there long enough, on a quiet day, when the sky hangs low and the air is still, you might hear something carried on that wind. Not voices, not screams, just the faint echo of boots. Marching, marching, marching. A memory of men who walked through that gate as prisoners and walked out as ghosts in daylight.